I lived in the small town of Humphrey, Nebraska until I was 6 years old, and then we moved to the big city of Columbus, Nebraska. There were 15,000 people in Columbus and maybe about 600 or so in Humphrey. So I missed out on some of that small town stuff. This week I had supper with Father Bays, a friend of mine, and he grew up in Elgin, Nebraska, and was telling stories about small towns and how they know everything about you. Everybody in the whole town knows everything. And when he was a little kid, he wore these glasses that made him look like this Sherman character from the comics. And so then everybody started calling him Sherman. And still to this day, when he goes back to Elgin, they still call him Sherman. And he said, I'm a comic book character for people in that small town. I think, well, no, I didn't have that problem, but apparently Jesus did. He grew up in a small town of Nazareth, and he tries to come back home and do things, and they're like, we know who you are. We saw you in kindergarten, and we remember when you ran into that wall, just smack. So why are we even going to listen to you? We know everything about you. And so he couldn't work any miracles there. It's an odd story. Other than those of you from small towns, can feel good. Jesus had the same problem growing up in a small town. But I was thinking this week, why is this in the gospel? What was St. Mark trying to say that this is so important to know that Jesus grew up in a small town where they remembered everything about him, and so he couldn't do anything there? I think it seems odd. Well, one thought I had was, well, maybe Jesus, because he took his disciples with him to Nazareth when he went back, so maybe he's trying to teach them, when I send you guys out to preach, you might think that your family and your neighbors are going to be the ones who are going to be the most open to hearing this, but they're not. They're just not. Because look at my own experience. Look at me going back to Nazareth. So maybe you should probably go talk to somebody else than just going home. And you and I have probably had experiences like that where some of our friends or our family members, you might invite them to Cabrini. You should come to Cabrini. Nah, not going to do that. But you would enjoy it. No. They reject it. So maybe it was just to make us all feel good that we're going to get rejected. Jesus got rejected, so maybe the rest of us too. So it might be that. But then as I thought about it this week, I thought, oh no, this may not be a very good gospel at all. Maybe I don't like it. Because I started thinking, maybe this is that whole thing about how familiarity breeds contempt. And we have to be careful about it. See, Jesus follows in the tradition of his Father, and that is when God created us, you and me, God created us as partners. For some reason, this God of ours wants a partner. You'd think, well, you're God, you can do it all yourself, but that's not the way God made us, not the way our God works. Our God likes having you and me as partners, as co-workers in the kingdom. So what we do matters to God. And what those people thought in that small town matters. Because Jesus could do no miracle there, or at least he chose not to, because he wants partners. So they have to put their faith in him. There has to be some relationship there. And then, as we heard last week, in the earlier weeks in the Gospel of Mark, all it took was this desire on the part of people for healing or for raising from the dead, and it happened. But it took that cooperation. It took that partnership to make that happen. Got that? Does that make sense? So here's where it gets scary then for me, why I suddenly thought, maybe this isn't such a good reading. So what if St. Mark put this in there for you and me because over the years we get really kind of accustomed to a faith life. We get accustomed to religion. And then Jesus becomes, no big deal anymore. Because we've heard about it since we were kids. Oh yeah, that's the Jesus stuff. And so we don't really pray anymore, or we aren't excited about our faith, because it's just Jesus. Yeah, big deal. I know it certainly happens to clergy, because we get a lot more religion than you do. And so Jesus just becomes kind of, that's just Jesus. We might walk by the tabernacle if nobody else is here and just wave instead of genuflecting. Hi, Jesus. Good to see you again. Because it becomes familiar. And that familiarity then keeps us from really realizing who Jesus is and who we are. So is Jesus just a moral teacher for me? Or is Jesus truly my Savior? Is Jesus God or not? And maybe why my prayers aren't answered is because I'm not putting the faith there that I need to put there. I'm not letting Jesus be who Jesus is because of familiarity. I think that's a danger not just for clergy, but maybe for all of us. So how do we get around that? How do we stir up our faith? Because here's an image, maybe it's like standing water. You know what happens to standing water? It gets stagnant. It was clean when we put it in there, but it doesn't look so clean anymore. It's stagnant. It needs to be stirred up. The ponds, they always have to put those aerator things in them to keep them alive. And so for our faith, if we just become familiar with Jesus and with God, then maybe our faith becomes stagnant and it needs to be stirred up. So how do we stir it up? I think for most of us that means simply getting out of our comfort zone when it comes to our faith. Maybe it means reaching out where we're not safe, or doing something with others. I think it's what our Cabrini communities do, because you have to sit down with other people and talk about your faith. Stir it up a little bit so that you're a bit uncomfortable hearing somebody else's story, telling them your story, reaching out to forgive, reaching out to pray, doing a mission trip like some of you recently did to Guatemala, out of your comfort zone. Or perhaps it is what St. Paul talks about in that second reading today. It's just acknowledging that I need God. St. Paul says, God gave me this thorn in the flesh. We don't know what that was. But some physical disability that he might have had irritable bowel syndrome or something. Just something that he prayed to God to take this away. And God doesn't. Because God says to Paul, when you're weak, then Jesus can be strong in you. In your weakness is your strength. We need to acknowledge that we are all frail, all broken, all sinners, all in need of a Savior. I don't save myself. I cannot. It's Jesus who does that. And if I can acknowledge that, my weaknesses, then I stay as a co-worker with Jesus. For some reason, he wants us. For some reason, he needs your faith. He wants it. He desires it. It matters. Otherwise, nothing can happen. But if you're willing to let Jesus be your Savior and to have faith in him and allow him to work through you, then those miracles that took place in Jesus' day can happen again in you, around you, through you, because you work with him.